Tolkien's writings take place in the span of tens of thousands of years, from the Silmarillion to the Lord of the Rings, and yet technology and society seem to remain the same, as if Middle-earth exists frozen forever in time. Why? Well, for starters, after a closer examination, you'll come to understand that this is not the case at all, and if anything, Middle-earth is the opposite of frozen in time. Before we take a look at the lore itself, however, let us first explore the reasons why Tolkien himself chose to depict what may seem like the Middle Ages. If you were to describe j.r.r. Tolkien, one of the many words that you would inevitably come up is medievalist. Already from a very young age, Tolkien was fascinated by the Middle Ages and the rich history of his home of England, but also Western Europe and the European continent as a whole. Specifically, he was in love with the Anglo-Saxons and their society, and on an academic level, he was particularly interested in medieval literature and especially poetry. With this in mind, and in combination of what he saw as the English being stripped of their native myths and legends from this time, Tolkien originally wrote his Legendarium as a mythology for England, which was naturally based on this time period that he adored most. On a technological level, in order for him to achieve the theme he desired for Middle-earth, cities needed to have walls, battles were fought man to man, and soldiers used spears, bows, swords, and shields. Horses and donkeys were utilized for travel, and men and elves were ruled by largely feudal lords with their own heraldry and knightly oaths. Essentially, what you may consider a stereotypical medieval fantasy setting nowadays, a perception which was largely born out of the popularity of The Lord of the Rings in the first place. Beyond the medieval filter, so to speak, of the world, however, the themes of Middle-earth are likewise largely influenced by Tolkien's admiration for the Middle Ages, and no doubt his traditional Catholicism played an important role in all of the following. The virtue of serving your lord and king, of being reverent to Eru Ilúvatar, of being charitable, faithful and loyal, and not to mention of course his romanticism of the quest to save the world, of a glorious death, and of the heroic tale of Beren and Luthien, which is as if it came straight out of the epics of old. Of course, to say that things such as faith and loyalty are medieval is not to say that they are exclusively medieval, but rather that they play a very notable part in what the majority of people, Tolkien included, consider to be the romantic and chivalrous tales of the Middle Ages. This is an important thing to remember, as it is what the majority of his writings were supposed to be in the first place. Therefore, to have these medieval themes, medieval-inspired poetry, and mythical feeling of the world required that world to also contain the material things that came with the Middle Ages, regardless of Tolkien's overall fondness of the time period anyway. An Aragorn with a musket, for example, or trains dotting the landscape of Gondor would have certainly subtracted from the immersion of what is supposed to be our own Earth in the very distant past. The same, I think, would have happened if he were to give his characters bronze or stone equipment, as the idea that certain technologies were lost or rediscovered later on is a lot easier to swallow on that level as opposed to gunpowder or the combustion engine. This, of course, is another very important matter to consider. Tolkien has stated again and again that Middle-earth is not an imaginary world, but instead an imaginary time period in the very distant past of our own world. While magic and certain technologies were able to make the people of this fantastical ancient time more advanced than in our real-world history, to provide them with anything more than that would have subtracted from the overall experience of the world building. Moreover, even if we were to ignore everything I've mentioned so far, I think that Tolkien must have considered that a Middle-earth in which we are introduced to radical new technologies and more noticeable surface-level changes throughout the years would have required otherwise unnecessary effort throughout the world-building and narrative process. And not only that, but this decision may have diverted people's attention from what Tolkien truly cared about, the creation of myths inspired by the Middle Ages. With that said, as I mentioned in the beginning of the video, the entire premise that Middle-earth is frozen in time is actually wrong to begin with. The truth is that in Tolkien's earliest tales, chronologically, the Free Peoples are at the peak of their power. They are the most populous, at their greatest strength of arms, and the most stable and centralized politically. Not only that, but the Elves and Númenóreans especially seem to have access to technology not available during the War of the Ring. Master smiths like Feanor can produce the Palantiri and the Silmarils, master builders can construct impenetrable towers that stand stronger than mountains, ships that sailed faster than the wind and perhaps even on the wind itself. The craftsmanship of the weapons of those ages past are unparalleled for their power, which seems distant to the point of myth during the trilogy. The men of Numenor especially were so advanced that the men of Middle-earth who encountered them during the period of Numenorian colonial expansion would fall to the ground and worship them like gods. As such, Middle-earth is not frozen, it is in decline. In the Silmarillion and certain unpublished drafts, we see the awakening of men and how they went from naked barbarians to the most powerful civilization in the world, and then how they continuously fell to a worse and worse state until the coronation of Aragorn. We see them progress technologically to a peak and then fall off from that peak, and this is the state that we find them in during the Lord of the Rings. Their empire becomes decentralized, their material wealth and innovation are destroyed, and unrest spreads like wildfire. If you think about it, you can find numerous parallels in our own human history. It took hundreds of thousands of years to even establish the first ever proper cities, and then many millennia after that to utilize something like steel. Progress historically was slow, and you could spend millennia in what may seem as the same technological level, or even regress following a devastating event or societal collapse. The same is the case in Middle-earth. What you and I see as swords and horses being used 10,000 years ago, and swords and horses being used in the Third Age, makes us think that it is illogical, that society would have surely progressed by then, and perhaps even industrialized. Naturally, this does not consider the fact that industrialization, for example, required certain economic, demographic, colonial, and societal factors to propel it forward, outside of technology or any one invention. In our own world, if gunpowder, for example, had never been invented when it did, would armor and siege warfare have changed in the way that it did? Every single thing that has ever happened in human history was the direct result of its given circumstances and reality. And so, what may seem the same is actually a literary medieval foundation, and what we should really be looking for are the changes. For example, the Gondorians of the present using, on the surface at least, technologically similar equipment to the ancient Numenorians, as perhaps the medieval Italians would with the Romans, very broadly speaking, does not mean that they know or have the capacity to make the things the Numenorians used to make, much like the Italians did not have the capacity to construct aqueducts after a certain point and on the same level. A very broad argument, but you get the point. As you can see, technology in Middle-earth does and has changed, and in a way that is not foreign to our own human understanding of history, although in a fantastical and literary manner. It is important to remember that despite of any explanations within the world itself, where the medieval theme of The Lord of the Rings stemmed from was Tolkien's own love for the period and admiration for the work that it produced, which made him wish a similar feeling for his own creation, though not in an illogical way, as I hope I have showcased. A massive thank you to my channel members, and thank you very much for watching.